Okay, so we should go ahead, and I would like to ask Rastko, Jovanov, one of our precious organizers, to give his talk that he should be finishing by now on Esprit De Corps and collective engagement. So we're not going to be any more late. So.
Thank you, Ankush. Thank you. So, as most of us here know, the notion of engagement is a key term in a research currently being conducted by the majority of people employed at this institute. As a member of the research group for social ontology, allow me to present a few basic lines of my study so far, which has been included the notion of collective engagement into recent discussion within social ontology. Since we are doing it together at this institute circa 1.5 years, I try to expose and concise as possible in the form of theses and arguments, my own account and results, and probably pitfalls as well of existing research. The expression Esprit De Corps, spirit of the body or spirit of the group, points to cohesion of a group. That is, that a group is functioning, to borrow a phrase of Tuomela, in V mode. In my presentation, I will claim that the Esprit De Corps is both result and phenomenon of collective engagement. It is important to consider collective or shared engagement as a specific form of collective intentionality without which we cannot entirely explain the various forms of existence of social groups. I know that some social ontology philosophers share the collective intentionality with distributive pattern, like Bernhard, I think. I'm not sure. Yeah, but that's not important for my talk, so we can call it shared, collective, so. And I'm primarily thinking of so-called high-scale groups, so corporations, institutes, governments, grounded in a founding document, or what I like to call, using legal discourse, original intent. I will endeavor in the course of my presentation to show that collective engagement can more adequately explain the phenomenon of groups and joint commitments, obligations, rights and demands than the currently dominant socio-ontological theories. The phrase Esprit De Corps has its origin in the militarist discourse of 18th century France, and D'Alembert describes it in the encyclopedia, thus in the chapter on character of societies and particular groups. So in the famous encyclopedia, societies or particular groups within a people are to a certain extent little nations surrounded in a bigger one. They are like a graft, good or bad, implanted on the main truck. Thus, these societies usually have a special quality, sometimes referred to as Esprit De Corps. In recent decades, Esprit De Corps has also infiltrated colloquial English, designating the glue that holds the group together. That is the feeling of togetherness. And here are a few examples that I found in media or internet. So the first source is the Huffington Post, so about international climate negotiation. So to be achieved in Paris will no doubt fall short of environmentalist expectations. But even so, if negotiations move even a small step in the direction of shared and real sacrifice of the kind made by the greatest generation in wartime, this demonstration of sacrifice for the common good will ripple through the sector, boosting economies, goodwill, and Esprit De Corps. And the second is from the Twitter. So Twitter gave gifts to its employees, and that gifts, so they can inspire a sense of Esprit De Corps, that they are all in it together. And the third example, it's from the Penn State University, so the economy of Esprit De Corps. So the economy of Esprit De Corps isn't for naught. According to Gallup, this engagement in American organizations accounts for more than $450 billion in lost productivity annually. And with less than a third of employees actively engaged in their work, according to the analytics company State of the American Workplace report, losses pile up quickly. Studies by the Queen's School of Business and Gallup found profitability, job growth, and share price all fell by more than 15% in organizations with low employee engagement. And so we can see from even these few instances that Esprit De Corps indicates persons who intuitively feel that there is something in common keeping them in groups or ad hoc activities they conduct together. So it's more something like a feeling. So we feel that we are in it together, that we are doing something together. But what is it that holds them together? And this is where we arrive at collective engagement. So right away, I would like to offer a preliminary observation about how we should speak of engagement. So let us begin with what engagement is not in my account, and what is the correct way to ontologically speak of collective engagement and engaged acts. Just to say something. Okay. So, aside from philosophy, engagement is studied by many social sciences, but always exclusively as engaged acts. I will later show that in addition to engaged acts, engagement also includes something else. So, engagement is not a new notion. However, in my presentation, we are dealing with an ontological understanding of engagement, and which is why I am not here interested in customary understanding of engagement. So first, engagement as personal does not interest me, such as engagement for my personal growth and betterment, such as might lead to better employment. Nor does collective engagement in small-scale groups, such as one's engagement with one's spouse to paint the house or open an organic farm somewhere in the countryside. Although these are a kind of collective engagement, they are examples of private engagement, and thus lack a few elements that characterize engagement in big-scale groups. So the prominent public nature as well as openness to new members. So both these engagements, they are private and close to new members. And as I understood Bernhard correctly, that's also true for plural pre-reflective self-awareness. So they are only the current participant in one group. So they are closed, and I have a problem to understand that a group must be closed or dissolved if it's not closed. Okay, that's a problem. That's something else. Okay, this kind of private engagement is close to new members and is characterized by an expectation of fulfillment of engagement. That is dissolution of the group. And this is also true of other customary uses of the word engagement. So a couple is engaged. Yeah, that's very customary. That means that they usually do not want to let anyone third into their dyadic group. They want to live, their joint life together, but in private, in their house. Yeah. They don't live in, this is my room, that's your room. They live in the whole house, but it's private. Or else, a lavatory door might have a sign engaged, which means occupied. And that's Peter's example. But which means occupied and close to others. So when I go to lavatory, I close it. Yeah. Further, I am not interested in the customary understanding of public or social engagement, since it is not necessarily characterized by collective intentionality, but can rather remain within the modus of individual intentionality, I-intentionality. Since we are dealing here with the ontological status of highly formalized groups, corporations, social movements, etc. So, therefore, I think that collective engagement that is not a distributive pattern of individual intentionality is the collective attribute in collective intentionality. But how then are we to understand engagement? Is it content, mode, or subject of collective intentionality? Before I answer this question, I would like to present once more the structure of engagement. So, in my account, collective engagement consists of engaged shared attitudes or states, and that is collective intentionality of ourselves, so of a group. So it's a collective intentionality about that we are doing things together, and I think that's very close to your account, Mehmet. And the second is engaged acts. So engagement is the structure is engaged attitudes of states and engaged acts. And what is most relevant here, and where is the point? Well, that one group can be engaged without engaged acts, which can but do not have to follow from engaged shared attitudes. At first, this might seem controversial, since it is intuitively more plausible to think of engagement as engaged acts. But in order to explain this, I have to return to the question of whether collective engagement is determined by content, mode, or subject. First, collective engagement is not primarily determined by content, so it's not content account of intentionality, since engaged shared attitudes of the members of the group refer to the group as such, to something done together. Thus, the group, or the we, is constituted as engaged, and engaged collective attitudes can have different content. So, we can be engaged today to propose Judith Butler for an honor doctorate here in Belgrade, and which we already done. But tomorrow we can be engaged about some other content. So, some other different content. But still, and that's the point, this does not mean that collective engagement entirely excludes content account. For when a group deliberatively determines a goal of action, what follows from their shared attitudes are collective engaged acts that can be explained entirely adequately through content account. And here is an example. Yeah. So there are two groups on the same field somewhere in the countryside, in Serbia, let's say. First group, a small dyadic group of two people sharing their collective intention of walking together and enjoying the countryside. And the second, a local hunters association, a big-scale group that is formalized and is characterized by founding documents that represent the original intent of their initial constituting. And at one point, a flock of birds takes flight. The members of the small dyadic group look towards the birds, sharing the collective intentionality of observation, that is the intentionality characterized by cognitive position. And I think that's the Husserl's way of thinking about intentionality. And their shared intentionality is not engaged. However, When the members of the Association of Hunters spot the birds, they are characterized by engaged intentionality, precisely because they had already had engaged shared attitudes. Whether these attitudes will result in an engaged acts or not, such as shooting at the birds, depends on their group deliberation. And for this very reason, engagement represents a more practical than cognitive position, practical volitive, so we can say volitive too, yeah, position, since the members of the group are engaged with regard to the shared attitudes of practical and volitive and not theoretical or cognitive kind. So the Association of Hunters, from the example, had already been collectively engaged, self-referentially, given the existence of the group. And if this argument holds, then we can say that group engagement is primarily characterized with regard to engaged shared attitudes that are also manifestation of self-awareness of the group, or what Michael Schmitz, who is unfortunately not with us today, calls self-representation as intrinsic capacity of intentionality. So, in other words, collective intentionality that lies at the foundation of any big-scale group as engaged shared attitudes represents a primarily subject account of intentionality. Even with a second component of engagement, that is with engaged social acts, it also encompasses a content account. Perhaps at this point, Raimo Tuomela would object, saying that I am actually speaking of the V mode and not subject mode. And while Bernhard Schmidt would approve, saying that the intentional subject is nothing that exists independently of its attitudes, and that is in virtue of some features of its attitudes somehow related to itself. That's the words of Bernhard Schmidt. And indeed, considering collective engagement shows that groups represent plural agents, and that there is really no need for postulating group minds or additional subject over and above heads of the members or participating individuals. So I should like to give this an ever so slight spin. This does not mean that I share Bernhard's position regarding pre-reflective self-awareness. Why? Because collective intentionality is intrinsically normative for me, and I cannot see a way for normativity to in any way be connected with pre-reflexive account of self-awareness, or what Katja yesterday named as experiential awareness of other co-subjects, but we can speak about it more. Therefore, groups are constituted on the basis of collective engagement and engaged shared attitudes, whereas, on the other hand, they assume self-awareness of members that they are engaged together. So, plural subject, I think. This is the notion of plural subject. That is, that collective intentionality of the group is self-referential, and I don't see a problem about that. I think Searle's position is also self-referential, okay? Since the engaged shared attitudes of group members are directed simultaneously towards the group and towards themselves, so towards the members themselves. So it's not that they have a collective intention of the group and then they have the other collective intention of themselves. That's the same collective intentions. However, collective engagement, as I have mentioned, also assumes engaged social acts, which proceed from shared attitudes. Such acts allow the concept of engagement in social ontology to encompass not only subject account, but also object account. And I think therein lies the advantage of this concept, since it abolishes and annihilates the still current belief that the collective and collective intentionality must be either subject or content of mode or mode of intentionality. While content account only tell us how we are engaged. And this can be collectively engaged as a corporation, engaged in politics or academically engaged, etc. However, that we are already engaged and not how we are engaged tell us that shared attitudes, that is a mental properties, which is to say self-representations and self-awareness of the group, these are the necessary and sufficient conditions for group constitution. Yet, if this is correct, then it has at least one major consequence. In that case, the group need not have a characteristic of agency, and this might also seem very controversial. If under agency we consider that is necessarily implies some kind of social action. In other words, groups could have an engaged attitude toward the world which might not necessarily contain any moment of action. And to bolster my thesis, recall Sartre's famous example of collective intentionality. So two cars have collided. The guests of nearby cafe have seen the crash and their attention is directed at the event. An excellent example in favor of the existence of collective intentionality, and I think most of us we remember that example. However, no one has run up to the scene of the accident to help the injured persons. All we have is collective intentionality, but yet we still don't have collective engagement. The activity of saving the motorist in collision is not a necessary consequence. I think that this shows us that the content of intentionality is not a sufficient condition for constituting a group. In order for the café patrons to become an ad hoc group, there needs to be a call. It is necessary for someone to call to action and thus burden the other potential group members. So for me, the call and the burden are the properties of a public nature. And in Sartre's example, had someone called for joint engagement, let's help them. I would, as café patron and one who possesses shared intentionality with other viewers, become engaged. Regardless whether my engaged act took place or not. What does all this mean? Well, that social groups can only appear with a call to grouping, but that it is not in the least necessary to have agency. To be engaged means that we are engaged in reference to ourselves, without any moment of action, agency Handlung. If this stands, I see no obstacle to offer a critique of representational theory of mind. Why? Collective mental states, beliefs, wishes, hopes, plans, and plural self-awareness are what lies in the foundation of engagement, not any sort of group activity or agency. Once again, I can be engaged without this entailing any moment of action. Why? Precisely because of the international moment that follows all mental states. Mental states or positions towards or attitudes towards the world are inherently normative. They are always about something or directed to something and produce various kinds of obligations. And the primary obligation is to work together to constitute the plural we within a group. All that follows after is content account and contingent upon the group. Because again, intentionality tells us that we are engaged about something, in something, but tells us nothing about the international object or content. On the other side, what do social sciences mean when they speak of a phenomenon? Surely nothing other than that fact is presented to us through consciousness. Very well. But then one might reasonably ask, what is a phenomenon of collective intentionality? In the most succinct way possible, a phenomenon in this case is the result of collective international attitudes. That is to say, the result of joint beliefs that have the capacity to become, in a given moment, an experiential phenomenon that obligates, and that is, engages all engaged members towards a specific kind of attitudes about something. Precisely because in the foundations of engagement lie joint positions, attitudes towards something. Still, what does the word collective tell us here? Nothing other than that we have joint intention or collective intentions, and issuing therefore a mutual obligations. We are engaged with regard to ourselves, not to the object of our engagement. Therefore, it is we who are engaged and not engaged with regard or in something or about something. And it is important to define engagement, so let me finish, I don't have any more time, through joint interaction alone, that is plural subject. It must be a phenomenon of the common that connects us even before any action. So before any action and regardless of the object of the action. Engagement can therefore be adequately defined only with regard to the subject. Engagement is mine, yours, hers, ours, and with regard to that, can we make differentiations among my, your, her, our engagement? Why? Engagement always belongs to one. It is more mental property than action itself. And the call and the burden presents even before the action tells us that we can be engaged even without any action. Thank you.
Thank you very much.